Chapter 3. A sage with a slight flaw in his character. The sign was old and shabby, and it hung above the open door of a sagging bamboo shack. When I timidly stepped inside, I saw smashed furniture and a mass of shattered crockery, and the reek of sour wine made my head reel. The sole inhabitant was snoring upon a filthy mattress. He was old, almost beyond belief. He could not have weighed more than 90 pounds, and his frail bones would have been more suitable for a large bird. Drunken flies were staggering through pools of spilled wine, and crawling giddily up the ancient gentleman's bald skull, and tumbling down the wrinkled seams of a face that might have been a relief map of all China, and becoming entangled in a wispy white beard. Small bubbles formed and burst upon the old man's lips, and his breath was foul. I sighed and turned to go, and then I stopped dead in my tracks and caught my breath. Once an eminent visitor to our monastery had displayed the gold diploma that was awarded to the scholar who had won 3rd place in the Imperial Qin Shi examination. And in schoolbooks I had seen illustrations of the silver diploma that was awarded to 2nd place. But never did I dream that I would be privileged to see the flower. The real thing, not a picture of it. There it was, carefully tacked to a post, not 2 feet from my eyes. And I reverently blew away the dust to read that 78 years ago, a certain Li Cao had been awarded 1st place among all the scholars in China, and had received an appointment as a full research fellow in the Forest of Culture Academy. I turned from the picture of the rose and gazed with wide eyes at the ancient gentleman upon the mattress. Could this be the great Li Cao, whose brain had caused the empire to bow at his feet, who had been elevated to the highest rank of Mandarin, and whose mighty head was now being used as a pillow for drunken flies? I stood there, rooted in wonder, while the wrinkles began to heave like the waves of a gray and storm-tossed sea. 2 red-rimmed eyes appeared, and a long spotted tongue slid out and painfully licked parched lips. "Wine!" he wheezed. I reached for an unbroken jar, but there wasn't one. "Venerable sir, I fear that all the wine is gone," I said politely. His eyes creaked towards a shabby purse that lay in a puddle. "Money!" he wheezed. I picked up the purse and opened it. "Venerable sir, I fear that the money is gone too," I said. His eyeballs rolled up toward the top of his head, and I decided to change the subject. "Have I the honor of addressing the great Li Cao, foremost among the scholars of China? I have a problem to place before such a man, but all I can afford to pay is 5,000 copper cash," I said sadly. A hand like a claw slid from the sleeve of his robe. "Give!" he wheezed. I placed the string of coins in his hand, and his fingers closed around it, taking possession. Then the fingers opened. "Take this 5,000 copper cash," he said, enunciating with a painful effort, "and return as soon as possible with all the wine that you can buy." "At once, venerable sir," I sighed. Having performed similar chores for our Uncle Nung more times than I cared to count, I judged it wiser to buy some food as well. And when I returned, I had 2 small jars of wine, 2 small bowls of congee, and a valuable lesson in the buying power of copper coins. I propped the old man's head up and poured wine down his throat until he had revived enough to grab the jar and finish the rest of it at a gulp. And long practice enabled me to slip a bowl of congee into his fingers and get it to his lips before he realized that it wasn't wine. 2 spots of color had appeared in his cheeks when he finished it, and after the 2nd jar of wine, he willingly attacked the 2nd bowl of congee. "Who you?" he said between slurps. "My surname is Lu, and my personal name is Yu. But I am not to be confused with the eminent author of the classic of tea. Everyone calls me Number 10 Ox," I said. My surname is Lee, and my personal name is Cow, and there is a slight flaw in my character," he said matter-of-factly. "You got a problem?" I told him the whole story, and I was weeping at the end. And he listened with interest and had me go over it again, and then he pitched the empty bowl over his shoulder so that it smashed upon the rest of the crockery. When he hopped up from his mattress, I was astonished to see that he was as spry as a goat. "Number 10 ox, eh? Muscles are highly overrated, but yours may come in handy," he said. "We will have to hurry, and for a variety of reasons you may be required to twist somebody's head off." I could scarcely believe my ears. "Master Lee, do you mean that you will come to my village and find out how a plague can learn to count?" I cried. "I already know how your plague learned to count," he said calmly. "Bend over." I was so stunned that I bent over backward until he advised me to try it the other way around. Master Lee hopped nimbly upon my back and wrapped his arms around my neck and stuck his tiny feet into the pockets of my tunic. He was as light as a feather. "Number 10 ox, I am no longer as fast on my feet as I used to be, and I suspect that time may be crucial. I would suggest that you aim at your village and start running like hell," said the ancient sage. My head was spinning and my heart was wild with hope. I took off like a deer. Lee Cow ducked as I bolted through the door, and my head struck something, and when I skidded from the alley and glanced behind, I saw that my head had struck the bottom of an old shabby sign, and that a half-closed eye was spinning around and around, as though it was peering at mysteries in every corner of the empire. I have no idea whether or not it was a premonition, but the image remained with me throughout our journey back to Khufu. Auntie Hua looked somewhat askance at the sage I had brought back to our village, but not for long. That antiquated gentleman stank of wine, and his robe was as filthy as his beard, and such was his air of authority, that even the abbot accepted his leadership without question, and Lee Cow walked from bed to bed, peeling back the children's eyelids and grunting with satisfaction when he saw that the pupils of their eyes were not fixed and dilated. "Good," he grunted. "It is not a question of teaching a plague how to count, which is quite simple, but of which agent was used, and I had feared that there might be brain damage. Now I need samples of mulberry leaves from every grove, clearly labeled so that we will know where they came from." We raced to do his bidding. Basket after basket of mulberry leaves was carried up the hill to the monastery, and Lee Cow placed them in vials and added chemicals, while the abbot adjusted the fires beneath alchemists' stoves. When the 18th batch of leaves turned the chemicals pale orange, Lee Cow began to work with great speed, boiling the leaves to a pulp, adding more chemicals, a drop at a time, increasing the heat and reducing the liquid. The pale orange color began to turn green. When the liquid had been reduced to nothingness, a tiny pile of blue crystals remained in the vial, and Lee Cow placed half of them into a new vial, to which he added some colorless liquid. Then he straightened up and stretched wearily. "Another minute and I will be sure," he said, and he walked over to the window. Some of the younger children, who had escaped the plague, were wandering disconsolately in the abbot's garden, and Lee Cow pointed to a small boy. "Watch," he said. We watched, and nothing happened. Then the boy absent-mindedly plucked a leaf from a tree, and he lifted it to his mouth and began to chew. "All children do that," Master Lee said quietly. "The children of your village, who were old enough to work in basket brigades, chewed mulberry leaves. But the older they were, the more self-conscious they became about doing childish things, and that is why the seizures were limited to children between the ages of 8 and 13. You see, we are not dealing with a plague, but with an agent that was deliberately designed to kill silkworms." He turned and pointed to the vial. The liquid had the evilest color that I had ever seen, slick and green and slimy and garish, like gangrene. "That is coup poison, for which there is no known antidote," he said grimly. "It was smeared upon the leaves in the mulberry grove that belongs to a certain pawnbroker Fang." A lynch mob poured down the hill, but the warehouse door was locked. "Ox!" the abbot snarled. I kicked the door halfway across the room, and a pathetic sight met our eyes. Ma the grub was lying on his back. Traces of coup poison smeared his lips, and he was as dead as Confucius. Pawnbroker Fang was still alive, but barely. His glazed eyes tried to focus on us, and his lips moved. "We never intended to. It was the silkworms," he whispered. "If they died, the IOUs own everything. Now my daughter—" He was almost gone. The abbot knelt and placed a small jade Buddha in the pawnbroker's hands and began to pray for his miserable soul. Fang's eyes opened one last time, and he looked blindly down at the jade Buddha, and he made a truly heroic effort. "Cheap, very cheap," he sneered. "No more than 200. Then he too was dead. Li Kao gazed down at the bodies with a rather strange expression on his face, and then he shrugged his shoulders. "So be it," he said. "I suggest that we leave them here to rot and return to the monastery. We have far more important things to worry about." Pawnbroker Fang and Ma the Grub had almost certainly killed the children of the village, but when I looked back at the bodies I could find no anger in my heart. The abbot led the way. We lit candles, and our shadows loomed like twisted giants upon the grey stone walls as we trudged down the long, winding flight of steps to the great vaulted cellar where the scrolls were stacked in long rows of wooden shelves. Our monastery is very old, and over the centuries the abbots had added to the library. The medical texts numbered in the hundreds, and I helped the novices bring scroll after scroll to the long tables where the abbot and his bonzes checked every reference to coup poison. The references were extensive, since the poison had been a favorite for assassination for nearly 2,000 years, and the information was always the same. The victims' vital signs would drop so low that they expended almost no energy at all, and could last for months, but nothing could restore them to consciousness, and death was inevitable. There was no antidote. The poison was said to have been imported from Tibet. Li Kao was the only scholar who was qualified to interpret the ancient Tibetan texts, such as Chalong Job Da Jad, and he said that the abbot's copy of Zaraga Dibjad was so rare that there might not be another one in existence. The rustle of the old parchment was punctuated by Master Li's soft curses. The Tibetan physicians had been magnificent at describing treatments, but terrible at describing symptoms, and apparently it had been taboo to mention by name any agent whose sole purpose was murder. Possibly, he pointed out, because the alchemists who invented such things belonged to the same monkish orders as the physicians. Another problem was the antiquity of the texts, which were faded and spotted to the point of illegibility. The sun had set and was rising again when Master Li bent close to a page in Judchi, the 8 branches of the 4 principles of special therapy. "I can make out the ancient ideograph for star, and next to it is a badly spotted character that could mean many things, but among them is the ideograph for wine vessel," he muttered. "What would you get if you combined the ideographs of star and wine vessel?" "You would get the logograph to awake from a drunken stupor," said the abbot. "Precisely. And drunken stupor, if used figuratively, is such a maddeningly vague description of symptoms that it could mean almost anything. The interesting thing is that the preceding text suggests seizures and clawing of air," said Master Li. "Can we say that the children are now lying in stupors?" He bent close to the text and read aloud. "To awaken from a drunken stupor, only one treatment is effective, and this will succeed only if the physician has access to the rarest and mightiest of all healing agents." He paused and scratched his head. "The ancient ideograph for ginseng is accompanied by the exceptionally elaborate construction that I would translate as great root of power. Has anyone ever heard of a ginseng great root of power?" Nobody had. Li Kao went back to the text. "The great root must be distilled to the essence, and 3 drops must be applied to the tongue of the patient. The treatment must be repeated 3 times, and if it is truly the great root, the patient will recover almost immediately. Without such a root, no cure is possible." Master Li paused for emphasis. "And while the patient may remain in his stupor for months, he cannot be awakened, and death is inevitable." "Coup poison," the abbot exclaimed. Now the Bonzes checked every reference to ginseng, which meant almost every page, because at one time or another the plant had been prescribed for almost every ailment known to man. But nowhere was there a reference to a great root of power. We had reached a dead end. Li Kao suddenly smacked the table and jumped to his feet. "Back to Pawnbroker Fang's office at the warehouse," he commanded, and he started up the stairs at a trot, with the rest of us at his heels. "The Guild of Pawnbrokers represents the world's second oldest profession, and their records are older than the oracle bones of An Yang. The Guild publishes lists of extremely rare and valuable items that might escape the untutored eye, and a great root of power, if such a thing exists, will probably be worth 10 times its weight in diamonds and look like a dog turd," he explained. "A fellow like Fang would undoubtedly subscribe to the entire list, in hopes of swindling an heir who does not know the value of his inheritance." He trotted rapidly down the path and through the door of the warehouse, and then he trotted right over the spot where the 2 bodies should have been lying. "Those fellows," he said in answer to our stunned expressions, "oh, they got up and took their heels a long time ago." I grabbed the abbot and held him, but Big Hong and a number of others were closing in on the ancient sage in a menacing manner. "Do you mean that you knew all along that those murderers were faking their suicides?" the abbot roared. "Of course, but one should be careful about charging them with murder. So far as I know, they haven't killed anyone yet, and they certainly never intended to," Master Li said calmly. "Reverend Sir, have you considered the plight of Pawnbroker Fang's children? His daughter will probably die. But even if she recovers, what sort of a life could she look forward to when she discovered that her father had been torn to pieces by the people of her own village? Her little brother would be condemned to a life of shame at the age of 5, which seems a trifle unfair. Surely there is a family that will care for innocent children and explain that their father was only trying to improve the silk, but that he made a mistake and ran away, and all is forgiven." I released the abbot, who bowed to the sage, and Big Hong cleared his throat. "My wife and I will take Fang's flea," he said huskily. "Fawn too, if she lives. They will have a loving home." "Good man," said Master Li. "As for Pawnbroker Fang and Mother Grub, why not let them punish themselves? Greed such as theirs gnaws at the vitals like packs of rats, day and night, never ceasing, and when they arrive in hell, they will have already experienced whatever torments the Yama Kings may decree. Now, let's go to work." Fang's files were so extensive that they filled 2 large cabinets and a trunk, and the abbot found the first reference to a great root of power. We had no idea whether it was the same as the great root of power, or the Bonzes found 3 other references, but only one of them was contemporary. 30 years ago, at a price of 300 talents, which I cannot possibly believe, a root of power was sold to the ancestress, said the abbot, looking up from his lists. "There is no further mention of it, and I assume that it is still in the dear lady's possession." Li Kao looked as though he had bitten into a green persimmon. "If that woman laid eyes on me, she'd have my head in 2 seconds," he said sourly. Then he had second thoughts. "Come to think of it, it would be a miracle if she recognized me. She couldn't have been more than 16 when I was summoned to the Emperor's palace, and that was a good 50 years ago." "Master Li, you were summoned by an emperor?" I asked with wide eyes. "Oh, several, but this particular one was Old Wen," he said. "In the carefree days of my youth, I once sold him some shares in a mustard mine." We stared at him. "A mustard mine?" the abbot said weakly. "I was trying to win a bet concerning the intelligence of emperors," he explained. "When I was summoned to court, I assumed that I was going to be rewarded with the death of 10,000 cuts. But Emperor Wen had something else in mind. Oddly enough, it was sericulture. Some barbarians were trying to learn the secret of silk, and the emperor thought that they might be getting close to the truth. 'Li Kao,' he commanded, 'sell these dogs a mustard mine.' It was one of the most ghastly experiences of my life." Li Kao turned and trotted back out the door, and we followed like sheep as he started back toward the monastery. I was learning that there were many sides to Master Li, and I listened with fascination. I had to turn their brains to butter with strong wine, and every morning I pried my eyelids open and glared at red-bearded barbarians who were snoring in puddles of vomit, he said. They had the constitutions of billy goats, and it was a month and a half before I was able to persuade them that silk is extracted from the semen of snow-white dragons that breed only in caverns concealed in the mysterious Mongolian glaciers. Before sailing away with the sad news, their leader came to see me. He was an oaf named Procopius, and the wine had not improved his appearance. "Oh, great and mighty Master Li, pray impart to me the secret of wisdom," he bawled. A silly smile was sliding down the side of his face like a dripping watercolor, and his eyeballs resembled a pair of pink pigeon eggs that were gently bouncing in saucers of yellow wonton soup. To my great credit, I never batted an eyelash. "Take a large bowl," I said. "Fill it with equal measures of fact, fantasy, history, mythology, science, superstition, logic, and lunacy. Darken the mixture with bitter tears, brighten it with howls of laughter, toss in 3,000 years of civilization, bellow 'Kanpei,' which means dry cup, and drink to the dregs." Procopius stared at me. "And I will be wise?" he asked. "Better," I said. "You will be Chinese." Li Kao led the way back to the infirmary and slowly walked up the long line of beds. Weariness bowed his shoulders, and in the bright morning sunlight his wrinkled skin was nearly transparent. The children of Khufu looked like wax effigies. Fang's fawn had always been pretty, but now the bone structure was showing beneath her smooth skin. She was exquisite, as a carving in white jade is exquisite, without warmth or life. On the bed next to her was a woodcutter's daughter named Bone Helmet, a thin, plain girl who had been gentle and loving. Since she had been old enough to thread a needle, she had worked on her father's burial garment, and he had proudly worn it at every festival, and now the heartbroken father had dressed his daughter in his own garment. Bone Helmet looked incredibly small and helpless in a blue silk robe that was 5 times too big for her, and the irony of longevity that she had embroidered over it in gold thread was not very funny. Favorite toys had been placed near each child's limp hands, and the parents sat silent and helpless beside the beds. Mournful howls drifted up from the village where lonesome dogs were searching for their young masters. Li Kao sighed and straightened his shoulders and beckoned for me to come closer. "Number 10 ox. I have no idea whether or not a root of power is the same as a great root of power, and for all I know, the only use for such a thing is to mix it with glue and use it to repair sandals," he said quietly. "2 things I do know. Anyone who tries to steal a valuable item from the ancestress is begging for an unpleasant death, and I am now too old to attempt it without having some muscle to back me up. I have accepted your 5,000 copper cash, and you are my client, and the decision is yours." "Master Li, when do we leave?" I asked eagerly. I was ready to race out the door, but he looked at me wryly. "Ox, if the children die suddenly, there is nothing that we can do about it, and if the textbook prognosis holds true, they should last for months. The worst thing that we could do would be to arrive at our destination weary and unprepared," he said patiently. "I'm going to get some rest, and if you can't sleep, perhaps the abbot will be kind enough to expand your education on the subject of the quest. Ginseng is the most interesting as well as the most valuable plant in the whole world." He yawned and stretched. "We'll have to go back through Peking to pick up some money, and we'll leave at the first watch," he said. Li Kao lay down in the bonze's bedchamber. I had never been so wide awake in my life. The abbot took me into his study for instruction, and what I learned about ginseng was so interesting that I was almost able to forget the children for an hour.